The sun was setting over Oakwood, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as Officer Richard Wilson finished his coffee at the corner diner. He'd been with the Oakwood Police Department for 15 years, and in that time, he'd developed certain ideas about who belonged in which neighborhoods. His fellow officers knew about his views. Some stayed quiet, some agreed with him, and others tried to avoid working with him when possible. Wilson tossed his coffee cup in the trash and headed back to his patrol car. The evening shift was just beginning, and he was already in a bad mood. His supervisor had questioned him earlier that day about a complaint filed by a Hispanic family he'd pulled over last week. Wilson had brushed it off as people just trying to cause trouble for cops doing their jobs. "These people move into our neighborhoods and then complain when we try to keep things safe," he muttered to himself as he started his car. He adjusted his uniform and checked his appearance in the rearview mirror. The badge gleamed in the fading light. To Wilson, that badge meant power, and he liked the feeling it gave him. A few miles away, FBI Captain Anthony Chen was driving home after a 14-hour day at the regional field office. The case he was working on involved a human trafficking ring, and the details weighed heavily on him. He was looking forward to getting home, having dinner with his wife, and maybe catching a few hours of sleep before diving back into work tomorrow. Chen was dressed in plain clothes, a simple navy blue suit with a white shirt. His tie loosened around his neck. His FBI credentials and badge were tucked inside his jacket pocket, and his service weapon was secured in its holster under his suit jacket. He'd been with the Bureau for 12 years, working his way up from a field agent to captain through hard work and dedication. As Chen drove through a quiet residential area, he noticed the flashing lights of a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. He checked his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. Still, he did what any law-abiding citizen would do. He signaled, pulled over to the side of the road, and waited. Officer Wilson had spotted the dark sedan driven by Chen and decided it looked suspicious. The car was too nice for this part of town, Wilson thought, and the driver didn't look like he belonged here. Wilson called in the license plate but didn't wait for a response before hitting the lights and pulling the car over. Chen rolled down his window as Wilson approached, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel as he'd been trained to do, as he trained his own agents to do. "License and registration," Wilson said, not bothering with a greeting. His hand rested casually on his holstered weapon, a stance he often took when approaching vehicles. "Good evening, officer," Chen replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. "My name is Anthony Chen. I'm a captain with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm going to reach slowly into my jacket for my credentials, okay?" Wilson's expression changed, his eyes narrowing. "Sure you are," he said with a smirk. "And I'm the president. Keep your hands where I can see them." Chen remained calm. "Officer, I understand your caution. I'm simply trying to identify myself properly. I'm going to move very slowly." As Chen began to reach inside his jacket, Wilson drew his weapon in one swift motion. "I said don't move," he shouted, pointing the gun directly at Chen's face. A passing car slowed down, the driver witnessing the escalating situation. Another car stopped across the street and a woman inside began recording with her phone. "Officer, please," Chen said, his voice steady despite looking down the barrel of Wilson's gun. "I'm a federal agent. I'm just reaching for my identification." People always think you're above the law," Wilson snarled. "I don't care who you think you are. In my town, you do what I say." The words hung in the air, loaded with more than just anger. Several bystanders had gathered now, watching from a distance as the situation unfolded. Chen took a deep breath. "Officer, I'm going to stay very still. But I need you to understand that I am a federal agent, and pointing your weapon at me, without, causes a serious offense. Let's both take a moment to de-escalate this situation." Wilson's radio crackled with the response from dispatch about the license plate he'd called in. He ignored it, keeping his weapon trained on Chen. "Get out of the car," Wilson demanded. "Slowly, hands where I can see them." Chen complied, moving with deliberate care. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the shoulder holster containing his service weapon became visible beneath his jacket. Gun! Wilson shouted, though Chen made no move toward the weapon. Officer, I am an FBI captain. That is my service weapon. I am not reaching for it. I am going to stand perfectly still while you verify my identity, Chen said, his training kicking in as he tried to prevent the situation from escalating further. A second patrol car pulled up, responding to Wilson's earlier call. Officer Diane Taylor stepped out, immediately assessing the tense standoff. Wilson, what's going on? She called out, approaching cautiously. This guy claims he's FBI. Says he has a gun, Wilson replied, not lowering his weapon. Taylor looked at Chen, noting his calm demeanor despite having a gun pointed at him. Sir, can you identify yourself? My name is Anthony Chen, captain with the FBI. My credentials are in my inside jacket pocket, and yes, I am carrying my service weapon in a shoulder holster. I have not reached for it, nor do I intend to. Taylor turned to Wilson. Let me check his ID. Keep covering me if you're concerned. Wilson reluctantly allowed Taylor to approach Chen. She carefully reached into his jacket pocket and removed his FBI credentials. After examining them, her expression changed. Wilson, he's legit. This is Captain Chen from the regional office, she said, showing Wilson the credentials. Instead of lowering his weapon, Wilson became more agitated. I don't care who he is. He was reaching for something when I approached. For all I know, those could be fake. By now, several more bystanders had gathered. Some had their phones out recording the incident. A man in one of the nearby houses had called 911, reporting an officer with his weapon drawn on a well-dressed man who appeared to be cooperating. Wilson, lower your weapon, Taylor said firmly. He's identified himself properly. He's one of us. He's nothing like us, Wilson muttered, but loud enough for both Chen and Taylor to hear. Chen remained perfectly still, understanding that any sudden movement could make the situation worse. Officer Wilson, I understand you're doing your job, but I've identified myself as a federal agent. I've cooperated with all your commands. There's no reason for your weapon to remain drawn. Wilson's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. You don't tell me how to do my job. Another police car arrived at the scene, this one unmarked. A man in a suit stepped out, Lieutenant David Rodriguez, head of internal affairs for the Oakwood Police Department. He had been nearby when the call came in about an officer with his weapon drawn in a tense situation. Wilson, Rodriguez called out, stand down immediately. Wilson hesitated, glancing between Chen and Rodriguez. That's an order, officer, Rodriguez said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Holster your weapon now. Finally, Wilson lowered his gun, though he didn't immediately holster it. Rodriguez approached quickly, positioning himself between Wilson and Chen. Captain Chen, I apologize for this incident. Are you all right, sir? You know him? Wilson asked, surprise evident in his voice. Everyone at headquarters knows Captain Chen, Rodriguez replied. He's conducted joint training with our department multiple times. The reality of the situation finally seemed to dawn on Wilson, but instead of apologizing, he became defensive. He was acting suspicious, reached for something inside his jacket. I was reaching for these, Chen said calmly, holding up his FBI credentials that Taylor had returned to him, as I clearly stated I was going to do. Rodriguez turned to Wilson. Holster your weapon and step back to your vehicle. Now. As Wilson reluctantly complied, Chen noticed the body camera on Wilson's uniform. The entire incident had been recorded. Captain Chen, I cannot apologize enough for this, Rodriguez said. I assure you this will be fully investigated. Chen nodded, maintaining his professional composure despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. I appreciate that, Lieutenant. I'll be filing a formal report with both your department and my superiors. As more officers arrived at the scene, the bystanders were asked to step back. But the damage was done. Videos of the incident were already being shared online, showing an officer pointing his gun at a calm, cooperative man who turned out to be an FBI captain. Wilson sat in his patrol car, anger replacing his initial shock. He knew he was in trouble, but in his mind he'd done nothing wrong. He couldn't see that his actions had been driven by prejudice rather than proper policing. Chen gave his statement to Rodriguez, detailing the stop, Wilson's aggressive approach, and the threats made while a gun was pointed at him. As he finally drove home an hour later, Chen thought about how differently the situation might have ended if he hadn't been a federal agent, if there hadn't been witnesses, if there hadn't been body cameras. The incident would spark investigations, revelations, and eventually justice. But that night, as the news began to spread through the department and the community, it was just the beginning of a story that would change Oakwood forever. The morning after the incident, Captain Anthony Chen sat in his office at the FBI regional headquarters, staring at the formal complaint he'd just finished typing. The events of the previous evening played over and over in his mind. The flash of Officer Wilson's gun, the hatred in his eyes, the absolute certainty that Chen didn't belong in that neighborhood. Chen's phone hadn't stopped ringing since he arrived at work. His supervisor, Deputy Director Thomas Rivera, had already called, twice wanting a full briefing on what had happened. Local news stations had somehow gotten wind of the story and were running with headlines like, FBI captain held at gunpoint by local police. One of the bystander videos had already racked up thousands of views online. A knock at his door interrupted Chen's thoughts. It was Rivera. "You doing okay?" Rivera asked, closing the door behind him. Chen nodded. "I'm fine. Just finishing up my report." Rivera took a seat across from Chen's desk. "I spoke with the Oakwood police chief this morning. He's beside himself. Says he wants to personally apologize to you." "What's going to happen to Wilson?" Chen asked. "He's been placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation." Rivera paused. "But between you and me, I think they know they've got a serious problem on their hands." Chen leaned back in his chair. "It wasn't just the gun, Thomas. It was the way he looked at me, the things he said. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a case of being overly cautious. This was pure prejudice." "I know," Rivera said quietly, "and we're going to make sure it's addressed properly. The Bureau is taking this very seriously. The director himself called me this morning." Across town at the Oakwood Police Department, a very different conversation was taking place. Lieutenant David Rodriguez from Internal Affairs sat in a small conference room, reviewing Officer Wilson's body camera footage for the third time. With him was Police Chief Robert Patel and the department's legal counsel, Grace Thompson. "Play it again," Chief Patel said, his face grim. "I want to make sure we're not missing anything." Rodriguez hit play, and they watched once more as Wilson approached Chen's car, the immediate hostility in his voice, the quick escalation to drawing his weapon, and the comments that clearly indicated bias. When the video ended, the room was silent for a moment. "There's no defending this," Thompson said finally. The officer had no justification for drawing his weapon, let alone keeping it trained on a federal agent who was clearly cooperating and repeatedly identifying himself. Chief Patel rubbed his temples. "And the comments. God, the comments. People always think you're above the law. What the hell was Wilson thinking?" "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Wilson," Rodriguez said, opening a folder in front of him. "I pulled his record this morning. There have been 6 formal complaints filed against him in the past 3 years, all from minority citizens claiming unfair treatment during routine stops." "And what happened with those complaints?" the chief asked. Rodriguez hesitated. "They were all dismissed for lack of evidence. Wilson's previous body camera footage was always conveniently unclear, or the camera was reported as malfunctioning. But not this time," Thompson noted. "No," Rodriguez agreed. "This time we have clear footage, plus the bystander videos. And the victim is an FBI captain, not someone Wilson could intimidate into dropping the complaint." Chief Patel stood up and paced the small room. "I want a complete review of every complaint ever filed against Wilson. Go back through his entire 15 years with the department. I want to know if there's a pattern here that we missed, or, worse, that someone deliberately ignored." "There's more," Rodriguez said. "I've been getting calls all morning from officers wanting to come forward with information about Wilson. Apparently his views weren't exactly a secret around the department. The chief stopped pacing. Why am I just hearing about this now? You know how it is, Chief, Rodriguez said carefully. The blue wall of silence. Nobody wants to be the one to rat out a fellow officer. Well, that wall is coming down today, Chief Patel declared. I want statements from everyone who worked with Wilson, and I mean everyone. As this meeting was taking place, Officer Richard Wilson sat in his living room, television blaring the local news coverage of the incident. His phone had been ringing non-stop, colleagues, reporters, even a few friends asking what had happened. He'd stopped answering after the first few calls. His wife, Linda, watched him from the kitchen doorway, concern etched on her face. Rick, you need to talk to me, she said. What exactly happened last night? Wilson kept his eyes on the TV. They're making it into something it wasn't. I was just doing my job. That's not what the news is saying. They're saying you pulled a gun on an FBI agent who wasn't threatening you. He was reaching for something, Wilson insisted. I didn't know he was FBI. Would it have made a difference if he wasn't? Linda asked quietly. Wilson finally looked at his wife, anger flashing in his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Before she could answer, Wilson's phone rang again. This time it was his union representative. Wilson, he answered. Rick, it's Paul. We need to talk. The department is moving fast on this one. They're already talking about possible criminal charges. Wilson felt his stomach drop. Criminal charges for doing my job? Rick, I've seen the body cam footage. This isn't going to be easy to defend. The department is under enormous pressure. The video is all over social media. So what are you saying? I'm saying you need a good lawyer, and you need one now. The union will provide legal representation, but you need to be prepared. This isn't going to just blow over. After hanging up, Wilson sat in stunned silence. Linda had gone back to the kitchen, unable to continue the conversation that had been building between them for years. Her growing discomfort with her husband's views and comments about minorities, the changes she'd seen in him over his years. On the force. Meanwhile, in a small community center in Oakwood, local activists had gathered to discuss the incident. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls. Community organizer Thomas Jefferson, no relation to the founding father, as he often joked, stood at the front of the room. What happened to Captain Chen last night is not an isolated incident, he told the crowd. It's just the first time it happened to someone with enough power that it couldn't be swept under the rug. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. For years we've been filing complaints about Officer Wilson and others like him, Jefferson continued. We've been told there wasn't enough evidence, or that we were exaggerating, or that we must have done something to provoke the officer. Well, now the whole world can see what we've been talking about. A middle-aged woman stood up. My son was pulled over by Wilson 3 months ago. He was just driving home from his night shift. Wilson made him get out of the car, searched him, on the side of the road at 2 a.m., talked to him like he was nothing. When we filed a complaint, they said it was standard procedure. Others began sharing similar stories, tales of harassment, unwarranted searches, casual cruelty, and dismissive responses when they tried to report these incidents. This time has to be different, Jefferson insisted. We have video evidence. We have an FBI captain as the victim. We have witnesses, and we have each other. We're going to show up at every city council meeting, every police commission hearing, every public forum, until there is justice, not just for Captain Chen, but for everyone in this community who's ever been mistreated by Officer Wilson or any other officer who abuses their power. Back at FBI headquarters, Chen was briefing a task force that had been quickly assembled to investigate the incident as a potential civil rights violation. I want to be clear, Chen told the assembled agents. This isn't about me. I'm fine, but this officer has been on the force for 15 years. How many other people has he treated this way? People who didn't have a badge to protect them, who didn't have the full weight of the FBI behind them. Agent Nicole Harper nodded. We've already started gathering complaints filed against Officer Wilson. We're also looking into the department's handling of those complaints. If there's a pattern of dismissing valid complaints about discrimination, that's a separate issue we'll need to address. I also want us to look at the broader picture, Chen added. Is this limited to one officer with prejudiced views, or is there a cultural problem within the department? Are there systemic issues that allowed someone like Wilson to remain on the force despite multiple complaints? As the day progressed, the story continued to spread. National news outlets picked it up. Social media was flooded with the bystander videos and hot takes from all sides. Politicians began issuing statements condemning the incident and calling for a thorough investigation. By evening, protests had formed outside the Oakwood Police Department with hundreds of people carrying signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No one above the law," including police. Chief Patel held a press conference promising a complete and transparent investigation. "What happened last night does not reflect the values of the Oakwood Police Department," he stated firmly. "We are committed to serving and protecting all members of our community with fairness and respect. Officer Wilson's actions are being thoroughly investigated, and appropriate action will be taken based on the findings of that investigation." As night fell on Oakwood, the wheels of justice had begun turning. For Officer Wilson, it was the beginning of a reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. For Captain Chen, it was an opportunity to address a systemic problem that affected countless others. And for the community of Oakwood, it was a moment of painful truth, but also perhaps the first step toward healing and change. 3 weeks after the incident, Lieutenant David Rodriguez sat in his office surrounded by stacks of files. His eyes burned from lack of sleep as he reviewed yet another complaint against Officer Richard Wilson. This one was from 4 years ago. A young college student claimed Wilson had pulled him over for a broken taillight, made him sit on the curb for 45 minutes, and repeatedly suggested he was driving a car too nice for someone like him. Like most of the complaints, this one had been dismissed. The official reason noted in the file: insufficient evidence to support allegations of misconduct. Rodriguez rubbed his eyes and added the file to the growing pile on his right, complaints that showed a clear pattern of biased policing. The II pile on his left, cases where Wilson had genuinely appeared to be following proper procedure, was significantly smaller. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Michael Clark, a 10-year veteran who had partnered with Wilson for nearly 2 years. "You wanted to see me?" Clark asked, hovering in the doorway. Rodriguez nodded. "Come in, close the door." Clark sat down, visibly uncomfortable. "Look, I know what this is about, and I'm not sure I have anything useful to add." "I think you do," Rodriguez said quietly. "You rode with Wilson longer than anyone else in the department. I need to know what you saw." Clark stared at his hands. "We're not supposed to turn on each other. This isn't about turning on anyone, it's about the truth. And right now, the truth is the only thing that might help this department survive what's coming." The silence stretched between them for nearly a minute before Clark finally spoke. "It wasn't just the stops," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was the comments in the car, the jokes, the way he'd talk about certain neighborhoods like they were war zones. At first, I thought it was just talk, just blowing off steam. But it wasn't just talk, was it?" Rodriguez pressed. Clark shook his head. "No. He'd target specific drivers. Young men of color in nice cars were his favorite. He'd say they must be drug dealers. He'd find any reason to pull them over, following too close, improper lane change, anything. Then he'd try to provoke them, get them angry enough to give him an excuse to search the car or make an arrest." "Did you ever report this behavior?" Clark's face flushed with shame. "No, I requested a transfer instead. Told the sergeant I wanted more experience in different areas. The truth is I couldn't take it anymore, but I didn't have the guts to say why." "You're saying it now," Rodriguez pointed out. "Yeah, well, now there's a federal investigation and videos all over the internet. It's a little late to grow a conscience, isn't it?" Rodriguez leaned forward. "It's never too late to do the right thing. Are you willing to put all this in a formal statement?" Clark hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I am." As Clark gave his statement to another internal affairs officer, Rodriguez turned his attention to Wilson's digital footprint. The tech team had recovered deleted text messages and social media posts from Wilson's department phone. What they found was disturbing: messages to friends with racial slurs, jokes about minority suspects, and comments about cleaning up certain neighborhoods. In one message to a former colleague who had moved to another state, Wilson had written, "Had another one today. Drove a car worth more than he'll make in a year. You should have seen his face when I made him spread eagle on the hood. These people need to learn their place." Rodriguez printed the messages and added them to his growing file. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a single incident of poor judgment. This was a clear pattern of biased policing that had somehow been allowed to continue for years. Across town, at the FBI field office, Captain Anthony Chen was meeting with Agent Nicole Harper, who was leading the federal investigation. "We've interviewed 23 people who filed complaints against Wilson," Harper said, opening a file on her tablet. "The stories are remarkably consistent. Initial stops for minor infractions or vague reasons like matching the description of a suspect, escalation without provocation, searches without clear probable cause, and always comments or questions implying they didn't belong in certain neighborhoods." Chen nodded. "What about the department's handling of these complaints?" "That's where it gets interesting," Harper replied. "We found a pattern there too. Complaints from certain zip codes or involving certain officers would get fast-tracked to dismissal. The required follow-up interviews would be scheduled at inconvenient times, or complainants would receive notice at the last minute. If they missed the interview, the complaint would be closed for lack of cooperation. So the system was designed to make it difficult to successfully file a complaint," Chen summarized. "Exactly. And there's more. We've identified at least 3 supervisors who consistently reviewed Wilson's conduct and found no issues, despite clear evidence in the body camera footage. One of them, Sergeant Frank Thompson, signed off on 14 separate complaint dismissals." Chen's expression darkened. "So it wasn't just Wilson. The rot goes deeper." "Much deeper," Harper agreed. "We're looking at potential civil rights charges against multiple officers and supervisors." Meanwhile, in a small apartment across the city, Thomas Jefferson, the community organizer, was meeting with a group of Wilson's previous victims who had come forward after seeing the news about Chen's incident. "I never thought anyone would believe me," said a middle-aged man named Luis Rodriguez. "When it happened to me 2 years ago, I filed a complaint. They made me feel like I was making it all up. Eventually, I just dropped it because it seemed hopeless." A young woman nodded. "Same here. Wilson pulled me over with my kids in the car, made me stand outside in the rain while he searched the vehicle. When I asked why I was being stopped, he said I looked nervous when I drove past him. How do you fight something like that?" Jefferson took notes as each person shared their story. "This time is different," he assured them. "With Captain Chen's case in the videos, people are finally paying attention. Your stories matter. They show this wasn't a one-time thing." One by one, they agreed to go on record, to tell their stories to the FBI agents investigating the case and to the Internal Affairs Division at the police department. Some had kept records, dates, times, badge numbers. Others had filed formal complaints that had been dismissed. Together, they formed a damning picture of an officer who had abused his power for years. At the Oakwood Police Department, Chief Robert Patel was holding an emergency meeting with his command staff. "The preliminary report from Internal Affairs is worse than we thought," he told them grimly. "Wilson's conduct wasn't isolated and it wasn't hidden. Multiple officers and supervisors were aware of his behavior and either ignored it or actively covered it up." "What are we going to do?" asked Deputy Chief Laura Chen, no relation to the FBI captain. "The only thing we can do," Patel replied. "Clean house. Anyone who knowingly allowed this behavior to continue will be held accountable. We're also implementing immediate reforms to our complaint process, use of force policies, and supervision protocols." "The union won't like that," someone pointed out. "I don't care what the union likes," Patel snapped. "We took an oath to protect and serve everyone in this community. If the union wants to defend officers who violated that oath, that's their business. But I won't have those officers in my department." As the investigation continued, Officer Wilson remained on administrative leave, isolated in his home. His wife Linda had taken their children to stay with her parents, unable to handle the constant phone calls from reporters and the hostile stares from neighbors who had seen the videos. Wilson's union representative called with updates that grew increasingly grim. More officers were coming forward with statements about his conduct. Digital forensics had recovered his deleted messages. Former partners were describing incidents they had witnessed. The wall of silence that had protected him for years was crumbling. "What about the other guys?" Wilson demanded during one call. "I wasn't the only one who did this stuff. Thompson and Riley were worse than me." "This isn't about them right now," his representative replied. "This is about you and what you did to Captain Chen. And frankly, Rick, with the evidence they have, you should be thinking about a plea deal." "A plea deal? For what? Doing my job?" "For civil rights violations, at minimum. Possibly assault with a deadly weapon. The FBI is involved now, Rick. This isn't going away." As Wilson's world collapsed around him, the community of Oakwood began the painful process of confronting the truth about their police department. Town halls were organized where citizens could speak directly to the chief and city officials. Body camera policies were reviewed and strengthened. An independent civilian oversight board was proposed. And in quiet offices and interview rooms throughout the city, the full story of Officer Richard Wilson's 15-year career was finally being told, not just by his victims but by those who had worked alongside him and stayed silent for too long. The blue wall was coming down, brick by brick, revealing the truth that had been hidden behind it. For some, it was a vindication they never thought they'd see. For others, it was a painful reckoning with their own complicity. And for the city of Oakwood, it was the beginning of a long journey toward healing and change. 9 months after the incident, the county courthouse bustled with activity. News vans lined the street outside, reporters clutching microphones and coffee cups as they delivered updates to cameras. Inside, security was tight as people filed through metal detectors and into the main courtroom. Richard Wilson sat at the defense table, almost unrecognizable from the confident officer who had drawn his weapon on FBI Captain Anthony Chen. His face was gaunt, his once crisp uniform replaced by a conservative Navy suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. Beside him, his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Daniels, arranged papers with practiced efficiency. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Victor Reyes conferred quietly with his team. They had spent months building their case, interviewing witnesses, reviewing body camera footage, and poring over Wilson's history with the department. The charges were serious: civil rights violations, assault with a deadly weapon, and making terroristic threats to a federal officer. As the gallery filled, Captain Chen entered with his wife. They took seats in the front row behind the prosecution. Chen had been preparing for this day for months, rehearsing his testimony with prosecutors, steeling himself to face the man who had pointed a gun at his head. The back door opened, and the jury filed in. 12 citizens of varied backgrounds who had been carefully selected after days of questioning. They avoided looking at either Wilson or Chen, keeping their eyes forward as they took their seats. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge William Davis presiding. The judge entered, a tall man with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes. He took his seat and surveyed the courtroom before speaking. "You may be seated," he said. "We are here today in the case of the People versus Richard Wilson. Before we begin, I want to make something very clear. This is a courtroom, not a circus. I will not tolerate outbursts, demonstrations, or any attempt to influence these proceedings from the gallery. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent rippled through the courtroom. "Very well," Judge Davis continued. "Mr. Reyes, you may make your opening statement." Reyes approached the jury, his manner calm and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about abuse of power in its most dangerous form. The evidence will show that on March 12th, Officer Richard Wilson pulled over Captain Anthony Chen without cause, escalated a routine traffic stop into a life-threatening situation, and held a federal officer at gunpoint while using language that clearly indicated bias." Reyes walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each member. "But this case is about more than just one incident. The evidence will show that Officer Wilson had a history of similar behavior, targeting individuals based on their appearance, escalating routine encounters, and abusing his authority. You will hear from witnesses who experienced this firsthand. You will see body camera footage that captured not just the incident with Captain Chen, but other troubling encounters, and you will hear from fellow officers who witnessed Wilson's misconduct and the department's failure to address it. He returned to the prosecution table and picked up a document. The oath that Officer Wilson took when he joined the police force includes a promise to protect and serve all citizens equally. The evidence will show that he betrayed that oath repeatedly and without remorse. We ask that you listen carefully to the evidence and return a verdict that holds him accountable for his actions. Thank you. As Reyes returned to his seat, Patricia, Daniel stood to present the defense's opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, police work is dangerous. Every traffic stop, every interaction, could potentially turn deadly for an officer. My client, Officer Richard Wilson, served this community faithfully for 15 years, putting his life on the line every day to keep you safe. She moved closer to the jury, her voice earnest. On the night in question, Officer Wilson observed a vehicle in an area where there had been recent reports of drug activity. He made a legitimate traffic stop based on reasonable suspicion. When the driver reached inside his jacket, Officer Wilson responded as he was trained to do. He drew his weapon to protect himself and maintain control of the situation. Daniels paused, letting her words sink in. Yes, we now know that the driver was FBI Captain Chen. But Officer Wilson did not know that at the time. He was simply doing his job, following his training, and trying to stay alive in a potentially dangerous situation. The prosecution will try to paint a picture of bias and misconduct, but we ask you to consider the reality that officers face every day, split-second decisions that could mean life or death. She returned to the defense table and placed her hand on Wilson's shoulder. Richard Wilson is not a perfect man. He may have made mistakes in his career, but he is not guilty of the serious crimes he's been charged with. We ask that you keep an open mind and remember that police officers deserve the presumption of innocence just like any other citizen. Thank you. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution built their case methodically. They played the body camera, footage from the night of the incident, the courtroom falling silent as they watched Wilson approach Chen's car, draw his weapon, and make the comments that had sparked outrage. Captain Chen took the stand, his testimony calm and precise as he recounted the events of that night. I identified myself as an FBI agent multiple times, Chen testified. I told Officer Wilson I was reaching for my credentials. At no point did I make any threatening movements or gestures. Despite this, he kept his weapon pointed at me and made comments that suggested his actions were motivated by bias rather than legitimate concern for officer safety. During cross-examination, Daniels tried to suggest that Chen's movements could have been interpreted as threatening. Isn't it true, Captain, that reaching into a jacket could be seen as a potentially dangerous movement during a traffic stop? She asked. Not when I clearly stated what I was doing, Chen replied, and not when I was fully complying with all other commands. Officer Wilson escalated the situation without cause, but you can understand why an officer might be cautious, especially in an area known for drug activity. Chen's response was measured. I understand caution. What happened that night went far beyond caution. It was aggression and intimidation. Plain and simple. The prosecution called a string of witnesses, people who had similar encounters with Wilson over the years. A college professor who was made to lie face down on the pavement during a stop for a broken taillight. A doctor who was pulled from his car and handcuffed while his children watched from the back seat. A young software engineer who was stopped 3 times in 1 month while driving through Wilson's patrol area. Their stories formed a pattern that was hard to ignore, each one reinforcing the prosecution's narrative of an officer who routinely abused his power. Then came the testimony that seemed to hit Wilson the hardest, his former partner, Officer Michael Clark. Clark looked uncomfortable as he took the stand, avoiding Wilson's gaze. Officer Clark, Reyes began, you worked with the defendant for nearly 2 years. During that time, did you witness behavior similar to what we saw in the body camera footage with Captain Chen? Clark cleared his throat. Yes, I did. Can you describe that behavior? Officer Wilson would often target drivers based on their appearance, He had certain phrases he would use. Someone who doesn't belong, or looks like they're up to no good. These were code words, really, for minorities driving in predominantly white neighborhoods. Did you ever hear Officer Wilson make explicitly biased comments? Clark nodded. Yes. In the patrol car, when it was just the two of us, he would use slurs, make jokes about the people we encountered. He seemed to think it was funny. And did you report this behavior? Clark's face flushed with shame. No, I didn't. I requested a transfer instead. I'm not proud of that. The defense team called character witnesses, Wilson's pastor, neighbors, and family friends who described him as a dedicated officer and family man. They brought in an expert on police training who testified about the dangers officers face and the split-second decisions they must make. Then, in a move that surprised many, they called Wilson himself to testify. Wilson took the stand, visibly, nervous but determined. Under Daniel's questioning, he described his version of events, his suspicion about Chen's car, his concern when Chen reached into his jacket, his belief that he was following proper procedure. I was just trying to protect myself and the community, Wilson insisted. I had no way of knowing he was FBI. But when Reyes began his cross-examination, the carefully constructed defense began to crumble. Officer Wilson, Reyes said, you testified that you stopped Captain Chen's vehicle because it matched the description of a car involved in a reported disturbance. Is that correct? Yes, that's right. Reyes picked up a document. I have here the dispatch records from that night. There was no reported disturbance matching that description. In fact, the only calls in that area were a noise complaint 3 blocks away and a false alarm at a business on the other side of the district. So I'll ask you again, why did you really stop Captain Chen's car? Wilson shifted uncomfortably. I thought it looked suspicious. Suspicious how? It was a nice car in an area where we've had problems. Problems with what exactly? Wilson hesitated. Drug activity, break-ins, that sort of thing. And what about Captain Chen made you think he was involved in those activities? The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for Wilson's answer. He looked around, as if searching for an escape before finally saying, nothing specific, just a feeling. Reyes nodded as if Wilson had confirmed something important. Just a feeling. Thank you, Officer Wilson. No further questions. As the trial entered its 6th day, both sides presented their closing arguments. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before reaching their verdict. When they filed back into the courtroom, Wilson stood with his attorney, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Captain Chen sat perfectly still, his wife's hand clasped in his. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Davis asked. The foreperson, a retired teacher, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the count of civil rights violations, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of making terroristic threats to a federal officer, we find the defendant guilty. As the verdict was read, Wilson seemed to deflate, the last of his defiance draining away. Chen closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over his face. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones toward Chen as he exited. Captain Chen, how do you feel about the verdict? Chen paused, considering his words carefully. This case was never just about me. It was about accountability and justice for everyone who has faced similar treatment. Today's verdict sends a message that no one is above the law, especially those entrusted to enforce it. As the sun set over the courthouse, the city of Oakwood took its first real step toward healing the wounds that had divided it for so long. The verdict wouldn't erase the pain of the past, but it offered something many had stopped believing in, the possibility of justice, even when the person who broke the law wore a badge. 2 weeks after the verdict, the courtroom was packed again for Richard Wilson's sentencing hearing. The former officer sat at the defense table, still in disbelief that his 15-year career had ended not with a retirement party, but with handcuffs and a criminal conviction. Judge William Davis entered the courtroom, his expression giving way nothing as he took his seat and reviewed the papers before him. The room fell silent. tension filling the air as everyone waited for him to speak. "Before I pronounce sentence," Judge Davis began, "I'll hear impact statements from those affected by the defendant's actions. Captain Chen, would you like to address the court?" Anthony Chen rose from his seat in the gallery and approached the podium. He had thought carefully about what he wanted to say, knowing his words would carry weight not just in this courtroom but potentially across the country. "Your Honor," Chen began, "when Officer Wilson pointed his gun at me that night, he didn't just threaten my life. He betrayed the trust that must exist between law enforcement and the communities they serve. This case has never been about a personal vendetta. It's about upholding the principles that make our justice system work: equal treatment under the law, accountability, and the responsible use of authority." Chen paused, glancing briefly at Wilson before continuing. "I don't take any pleasure in seeing Officer Wilson face prison time. But actions have consequences, especially for those who take an oath to protect and serve. My hope is that this case sends a clear message, not just to police officers but to everyone watching, that bias and abuse of power have no place in law enforcement." After Chen returned to his seat, several others came forward to give statements. Community members who had experienced similar treatment from Wilson, former colleagues who expressed their dismay at his actions, and representatives from civil rights organizations who spoke about the broader implications of the case. Finally, it was Wilson's turn to speak. He stood slowly, the weight of the moment visible in his hunched shoulders. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely audible at first, "I've had a lot of time to think since all this began. I still believe I was doing my job as I understood it. But I can see now that my understanding was flawed." He cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I never set out to hurt anyone. I thought I was protecting my community. But somewhere along the way I lost sight of who I was supposed to be protecting it from, and who I was supposed to be protecting it for." Wilson looked up, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "I can't change what I did, but I want the court to know that I hear what Captain Chen and others have said, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused." It was the closest thing to genuine remorse that Wilson had shown since the incident began. Whether it would make any difference in his sentencing remained to be seen. Judge Davis considered for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Wilson, you were entrusted with extraordinary power, the authority to detain, to arrest, and yes, when necessary, to use force. With that power comes an equally extraordinary responsibility to use it wisely, fairly, and in accordance with the law." The judge leaned forward, his voice growing firmer. "The evidence presented at trial showed that you repeatedly abused that power, targeting individuals based on their appearance and using excessive force without justification. The incident with Captain Chen was not an isolated mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of a pattern of behavior that you engaged in for years." Judge Davis picked up a document from his bench. "I've reviewed the sentencing recommendations from both the prosecution and the defense. I've considered the nature of the crimes, the impact on the victims, and your service record. Taking all of this into account, I sentence you to 6 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release." A murmur ran through the courtroom as the sentence was announced. 6 years was significant, more than many had expected for an officer who hadn't physically injured his victim. "Additionally," the judge continued, "you are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity in the future. Bailiff, please take the defendant into custody." As Wilson was led away in handcuffs, the full impact of the judge's decision rippled through the courtroom and beyond. For many in Oakwood, it represented a rare moment of accountability in a system that often seemed to protect its own at all costs. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Captain Chen and District Attorney Reyes. "Do you think the sentence was fair?" one reporter asked. "The judge considered all the evidence and made his decision," Chen replied diplomatically. "What matters now is what we do going forward. How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve?" 3 months after Wilson's sentencing, the Oakwood City Council chambers were filled to capacity as Chief Robert Patel presented his comprehensive reform plan. The fallout from the Wilson case had forced a reckoning within the department and the city government. The changes we're implementing today are long overdue. Chief Patel told the assembled council members and citizens. They include mandatory bias training for all officers, a complete overhaul of our complaint investigation process, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with real enforcement powers. The chief displayed slides showing the new body camera policies, which required cameras to be activated during all interactions with the public and included strict penalties for officers who failed to comply. He outlined new hiring practices designed to build a more diverse police force that better reflected the community it served. But perhaps the most important change, Patel continued, is a shift in our departmental culture. We're implementing a duty to intervene policy that requires officers to step in if they see a colleague using excessive force or engaging in misconduct. And we're creating a system that protects and rewards officers who report wrongdoing rather than punishing them. In the audience, Thomas Jefferson, the community organizer who had helped bring Wilson's previous victims forward, listened with cautious optimism. After the presentation, he approached the microphone during the public comment period. These reforms sound promising, Jefferson acknowledged. But we've heard promises before. The real test will be in the implementation and enforcement. Will there be consequences when these new policies are violated? Will the Civilian Oversight Board have the resources and authority it needs to be effective? And most importantly, will officers who report misconduct actually be protected, or will they face the same unofficial retaliation that has silenced whistleblowers in the past? Chief Patel nodded, recognizing the validity of these concerns. Those are fair questions, he responded. And the honest answer is that policies alone won't change a culture that's been in place for decades. It's going to take time, commitment, and constant vigilance from both the department and the community. That's why we're not just announcing these changes. We're establishing concrete metrics to measure our progress and making those metrics public. We want to be held accountable. Over the next year, the reforms began to take shape. The Civilian Oversight Board reviewed its first cases, sometimes overruling the department's internal findings and recommending stronger disciplinary actions. Body camera footage was made more readily available to complainants and their representatives. The department's demographics slowly shifted as recruitment efforts brought in a more diverse group of cadets. There were setbacks and resistance, of course. Some veteran officers retired, rather than adapt to the new requirements. The police union initially fought against some of the stronger accountability measures, but with public attention still focused on the department in the wake of the Wilson case, there was unprecedented pressure to show real change. 2 years after Wilson's sentencing, Captain Anthony Chen returned to Oakwood at the invitation of the new police academy director. He stood before a class of recruits, young men and women of various backgrounds who represented the future of the department. The badge you're working to earn is a symbol of public trust, Chen told them. That trust has been damaged, but you have the opportunity to rebuild it one interaction at a time. The power you'll be given isn't meant to set you apart from the community or above it. It's meant to connect you to it, to make you its guardian and servant. After his talk, one of the recruits approached him, a young woman whose father had been among those who had come forward with stories of mistreatment by Wilson. My dad was afraid of the police for years because of what happened to him, she told Chen. He didn't want me to join, but after seeing how things changed, after seeing someone finally held accountable, he changed his mind. He said maybe I could be part of making things better. Chen smiled, recognizing in her the idealism and commitment that had led him to law enforcement years ago. That's exactly why your voice is needed, he told her. The best way to change a system is from within, by people who understand what needs to be different. As Chen left the academy that day, he passed a wall where the department's new mission statement was displayed: to protect and serve all members of our community with fairness, respect, and integrity. The words had always been there in some form. The difference now was that there were systems in place to ensure they were more than just words. They were expectations with consequences when they weren't met. The change hadn't come easily. It had taken one terrible night when an officer had drawn his weapon on the wrong person, someone with the power and platform to make sure the incident wasn't forgotten or excused. It had taken brave community members coming forward with their stories. It had taken officers willing to break the code of silence. And it had taken leaders with the courage to acknowledge that the problem was real and required real solutions. Oakwood still had a long way to go. True reform wasn't accomplished in a few years with a few policy changes. It was a continuous process, requiring ongoing commitment from everyone involved. But for the first time in many years, there was genuine hope that the system could change, that justice could work the way it was supposed to for everyone.